Hello everyone, and welcome to the third in our series on Nehemiah. Today I'm going to be looking at the character and leadership of Nehemiah. And one of the first things I want to say is that Nehemiah wasn't just a biblical Bob the Builder. He was so much more than that. And so I'm afraid, Bob, that you're going to have to sit this one out while we look at the character of Nehemiah. Just let me put Bob down into a comfortable place, and then we'll begin. So a quick recap. We've had a couple of sessions on Nehemiah already, and so I'd just like to give you a little bit of background. So the Jews were taken into captivity by the Babylonians around 586 BC, and so the people were deported from Jerusalem. That was kind of the foreign policy of the Babylonians at that time. And then subsequently the Babylonians had been supplanted by the Persians. So the Persians had taken over, and they'd become the superpower of the ancient world. And they had a completely different foreign policy. Their foreign policy was one of repatriation. And so over a period of time, the Jews had been allowed to return to Jerusalem. Firstly, Zerubbabel went back. He took about 50,000 people with him, which is like no insignificant number. They went back in 538 BC. And amongst the other things they did, Zerubbabel was able to rebuild the temple. It took him quite a while because there was various opposition and the building project got halted every now and again. But eventually Zerubbabel managed to get the temple built. And then there was a second wave of repatriation with Ezra in 458 BC. Ezra led a group of around 2,000 families, and they returned to Jerusalem. Ezra was a priest and a scribe, and his focus was on getting the people to return back to God, to start worshipping God in the way that they should, because the people had been in the land for quite a while, and they got a little bit assimilated with the people around them, started picking up some of the practices of the other peoples who'd moved into that area, and that was becoming a problem. So Ezra went back, and his focus was on getting people to return to God. And now Nehemiah was still in Persia. He was in the capital in Susa, and he was working for the king of Persia. He had a very responsible job. He was cupbearer to the king. Now, sounds an odd job, but it wasn't just somebody who brought the king his cup of cocoa of an evening. This was a far more significant role. For one thing, he would taste the food and make sure it wasn't poisoned, so the king was safe to eat the food. But it was more than that. He was also like a counselor and a confidant to the king of Persia. Herodotus, the Greek historian, said in the court of Persia, the role of cupbearer was second only to that of the royal princes. And so Nehemiah was there. He had a good job, relatively secure job, and he was living in the capital Susa, but he was interested in what was going on in Jerusalem. And when he heard about people coming who might have news of Jerusalem, he was interested to talk to them. I think he'd probably built up in his mind a picture of how Jerusalem might be. You know, Zerubbabel had been back and gone back for quite a few years earlier. The temple had been rebuilt. Ezra has been there working with the people to bring them back to worshipping God the way it should be. And so Nehemiah just wants to catch up and find out what's going on. And we pick that up right at the beginning of the book of Nehemiah. And I'm going to read from chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. I think he was hoping to hear good things of how things had progressed. They said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. You know, this is not the news that Nehemiah wanted to hear. And Nehemiah says, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. See, Nehemiah empathized with the people in Jerusalem. He felt their pain, he felt their troubles, and he wanted to be able to do something about it. So he fasted and he prayed to God. And this is what he said. O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees and laws you gave your servant Moses. Nehemiah is empathizing. He's like, it's not, look what they've done. It's we the people, this is what we've done. I'm part of this. And he's empathizing with them. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favour in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. And this man that he was talking about was the king of Persia, the most powerful man in the ancient world at this time. And Nehemiah wanted an opportunity to be able to reach out to the king in some way and to be able to help the people in Jerusalem. And we see that it didn't take so long before he had that opportunity, as we pick up in chapter 2, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. The king didn't like to have sad people in his presence. He wanted people who made him feel good. He didn't want to see sad faces around him. And so Nehemiah goes on, I was very much afraid. This wasn't the thing to do. This wasn't the demeanour that you wanted in front of the king of Persia. You know, he could easily be replaced if he was upsetting the king. So he was very much afraid. But I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven. You know, at this point, Nehemiah fires off a quick prayer to God. He hasn't got time for any sort of clever words. He's just asking God to give him the words to say now that he has this opportunity. And he says, I answered the king, if it pleases the king and if your servants have found favour in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? You see, the king, he valued Nehemiah's presence. He valued Nehemiah's counsel. He didn't want him to go forever. He didn't want to lose him forever. So he wanted some kind of reassurance of when Nehemiah was coming back. In reality, it took 12 years before Nehemiah came back to the palace. But I don't think they knew that at that time. And so with the approval of the king, Nehemiah set off for Jerusalem. And not everybody was pleased to hear that somebody was coming. There's a couple of characters, Sanballat and Tobiah, who appear all the way through the book of Nehemiah. And they're always criticizing and trying to prevent this work being done. It says in verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Sanballat was governor of Samaria, and Tobiah, I believe, was governor of Transjordan. And we know that historically the Samaritans and the Jews haven't got on, and Sanballat wasn't keen for somebody to come and help the Jews. He was happy with the status quo. It served his purpose for the Jews to be downtrodden and repressed. And so the fact that somebody new was coming to try and help them, it wasn't in his interest, and he wasn't keen to have that happen. But Nehemiah, when he arrived, he didn't rush into things. He stayed 3 days, just settled in for 3 days. And then one evening, after 3 days, he went out on his donkey with a few men around him, and he did a survey of the walls, and he assessed the situation, and he looked at the task in hand. And then, because he hadn't told anybody why I'd come or what was going on, then he gathered the people together. And in verse 17 it says, "Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." All the way through, Nehemiah's talking about we the people. He's empathizing with the people of the situation that they're in, and he wants to get them motivated so that they can build the wall. And so it says, "I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me, and what the king had said to me." So Nehemiah explains. He wants to motivate them, encourage them to build the wall. And I imagine there was a certain reticence amongst these people, the Jews that had been living there for a while. You don't know our situation, Nehemiah. We've tried this before. We can't build. Every time we build, it gets knocked down. But Nehemiah was there for a purpose, and he wanted to motivate and encourage the people. And so he told them about how God had blessed him and in the king's presence, and had given him safe passage to go there and help them. And the people said, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. And the people were on board. The people were ready to build. But even then, Sanballat was saying, what is this that you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? He was trying to cause trouble. He was putting doubts in Nehemiah's mind. But Nehemiah says, "I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding." Nehemiah was trusting in God. And he said, "But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claims or historic right to it." So he was telling Sanballat, look, we don't want your help, and you don't have any claim on Jerusalem, and we don't want any interference. So Nehemiah motivated the people, and he got all the people involved. If you read through chapter 3, you can see the high priest was involved, the priests were involved, local officials were involved, perfumers, goldsmiths, all kinds of people were involved in rebuilding the walls. And so the work started, and people were building, and they had to go out and find the stones that they needed to build. So they had to dig around in the rubble and find the stones that they needed to be able to build up this wall. And Sanballat said, "Can they bring these stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" And Tobiah as well, they ridiculed the Jews in the presence of their officers and the army of Samaria. Tobiah said, what they are building, if even a fox climbed on it, he would break down their wall of stones. So they were kind of rubbishing the work that they were doing, rubbishing everything that they were doing. But I would say to you that it's a mistake to underestimate what God can build out of the rubble of our lives. All of us have rubble in our lives. We have things that we don't particularly like, and things that have gone wrong in the past, and things like this. But these people were picking through the rubble to find the stones, that could be built together to build a wall. And God sees in our lives the stones in our lives that can be built together. So it's a mistake. It's a mistake. Sanballat, Tobiah made the mistake of underestimating what God can do from the rubble. And so the people began to build, and they built up the walls to about half the height. And there was still constant criticism and Sanballat and Tobiah and their associates trying to put them off. And at a certain point in chapter 4, verse 10, it says, the people of Judah said, the strength of the labourers is giving out, and there is not so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. Also our enemies said, before they know it or see it, we will be right there among them, and will kill them and put an end to the work. The people were saying, we're tired and we're frightened. And this was a point that Nehemiah then had to motivate and encourage the people. It's a kind of a Churchillian moment in the history of Nehemiah. It's like when during the war, Churchill said to the people, I've got nothing to offer you but blood and sweat and tears. And Nehemiah was the same. He said to the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. First thing, remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. Don't be afraid. And fight for your brothers and your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. Nehemiah was encouraging them. He was encouraging himself, and he was encouraging the people. And so they carried on building, and they built up, and the walls were pretty much completed. And Sanballat and Tobiah, they were getting more desperate in their approach to try and put Nehemiah off. So they asked him for a meeting, said, can you come to a meeting in a small town somewhere outside of Jerusalem? We think probably with a view to trying to ambush Nehemiah and kill him and stop this project. But Nehemiah was too wise for that, and he said, no, I'm not coming down. I've got a big project on, and I'm not going to come down. You see, Nehemiah, he wasn't a sort of hard hat, high vis politician who just went for the photo opportunity. He was right there in the heat of the day with them, building the walls. He was the man who they would look to. He was the man who had the trumpeter next to him. That was like the early warning system that they had in those days, was a guy with a trumpet. And if there was a problem, or they saw somebody coming to attack, the trumpeter would sound, and the people would rush to Nehemiah. So he was up there on the walls, in the sight of the people, encouraging them. And Sanballat and the guys, they were really trying to put them off. And it says in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 5, then the fifth time, 5 times, they tried to frighten and discourage Nehemiah. And so this time Sanballat sent his assistant to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter. They wanted this letter to be seen. They wanted this letter to be read by everyone. And in this letter was written, it is reported among the nations, and Gershom says it's true. That always makes me smile. And Gershom says it's true. I mean, it would be comical if it wasn't such a serious situation. Gershom says it's true, so it must be true. That you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building this wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. Now there is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king. So come, let us confer together. If you don't come and talk to us, this message is going back to the king of Persia, and that's going to be trouble for you. And so Nehemiah said, I sent him this reply. Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work, and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. Nehemiah trusted in God. He also trusted that the king would remember the integrity and that he had shown when he was cupbearer at the palace, and he would remember what a loyal and faithful servant Nehemiah was. So Nehemiah, he ignored Sanballat, and he just said, what you're saying is untrue. And people can try say things about us and people can pass false reports about us. But if we are good character and we are people of integrity, we know that the truth will come to the surface and we can trust God. And Nehemiah said, now strengthen my hands. And we read in Nehemiah 6, verse 15, that the wall was completed in 52 days. Only 52 days to build the whole wall around the city of Jerusalem. It took decades for Solomon to build the first temple. It took years for Zerubbabel to be able to rebuild the temple. But in 52 days, with the help of God, Nehemiah and the people were able to build the walls. And it says in verse 16, when all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence. So that's Nehemiah, that's Tobiah, that's those guys. They were the ones who were afraid and they lost their self-confidence. And it says, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. The people began to recognize the hand of God working through Nehemiah and the people to achieve this building. And so the walls were finished, and then Nehemiah, he got Ezra to read the law to the people and to start getting the people to have a time of repentance and rededication. And then read in chapter 12 that it came time for the dedication of the wall. And what happened was that they got two great big choirs. So, previously Tobiah had said, even if a fox climbs on this wall, it's going to fall down. But that wasn't true, because Nehemiah and Ezra, they split into two teams, basically. They had a whole choir each, and they led the people round in opposite directions on the wall, around the wall, and they met up at a point on the wall close to the temple. Then they went down into the temple, and it says in chapter 12, verse 40, the two choirs gave thanks, then took their places in the house of God, and so did I, together with the officials. And they gathered together and they celebrated the work that God had done. And it says in verse 43, and on that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. I love that bit. I like to think that the sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem carried as far as where Tobiah was, as where Sanballat was, and they could hear the rejoicing that was going on. We're in an unusual situation at the moment. We're almost like exiles in our own land, with lockdown, not being able to get out to visit people, to do the things that we normally do. But we can learn from Nehemiah that we can empathize with people. We can empathize with those around us. We can empathize with those we know. We can empathize with other people. I'm thinking of a lot of us sponsor children through compassion and things like this, and we can pray for them in their situations. And there's also opportunities for online giving, so that we can not only empathize, but we can put that empathy into action, so that people can get healthcare, so that they can get hygiene products and be able to wash their hands and stay safe in countries all around the world. I'm thinking of Colombia and Guatemala and Kenya and Thailand and all around the world. We're compassionate are working. We may not be able to go there, but we can empathize and we can encourage and we can help in that situation. We can also motivate ourselves. This thing isn't going to last forever, and one day we'll be able to get out again. We'll be able to gather again physically in the church, rather than just online like we are now. And we need to motivate ourselves to prepare for when that time comes. Things may be a little different. Well, probably will be different once we've finished lockdown, but we can prepare ourselves, and we need to be motivated to be ready for that as well. And we can encourage one another. We can encourage one another through phone calls, through emails, just when we gather together online as well for communion and these things. We can encourage one another, and it's a great thing that the church is adapting. Nehemiah's building project was totally different to Solomon's building project. Solomon built in a time of peace and prosperity, and they built everything so perfectly. They didn't even have tools on site. In Solomon's time, they built the temple. They prepared the huge stone blocks and chiseled them and got them perfect, and then they brought them to site, and it said that there wasn't any sound of chiseling and iron tools on site, because they'd been able to do that. But in Nehemiah's time, things were different. So it's different circumstances require different actions. And Nehemiah gathered all the people. They weren't skilled stonemasons. They weren't working quietly. They were building a wall out of rubble and building it up and doing it in 52 days. So there's times when we can do things a certain way, times we do things another way. And this is the time that we're doing online church, that we can send out messages that we can share with one another. And it's really great. And I want to just leave you with this a thought from 1 Peter chapter 2. And in verse 5 it says, "You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Christ Jesus." And it goes on to say in verse 9, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." I pray that God will bless you this week, and I'll hand over to Julie now for the last song.